When people think of staying warm during World War II, they picture thick wool blankets, heavy coats, and soldiers huddled together against the cold. What rarely gets discussed is the material that quietly outperformed blankets in some of the worst conditions of the war. It wasn't worn like clothing, and it wasn't wrapped around the body in the traditional sense. It was placed beneath, around, and sometimes above people, cutting heat loss so effectively that even limited bedding became sufficient. This insulator was treated paper and fiberboard, layered and air-trapped, and it became one of the most important cold-weather survival materials of the era. This wasn't a marketing experiment. It was wartime necessity meeting physics. When supply lines were stretched thin and wool was prioritized for uniforms, militaries and civilians turned to materials that stopped heat loss instead of trying to generate more heat. That distinction mattered. Why blankets alone failed in prolonged cold conditions? Blankets work by trapping air around the body, but they fail quickly when compressed or exposed to moisture. In trenches, bomb shelters, refugee camps, and unheated barracks, people spent most of their time sitting or lying down. The moment a blanket was compressed beneath body weight, its insulating value dropped sharply. Cold ground pulled heat away faster than blankets could replace it. Military researchers quickly realized that insulation under the body mattered more than insulation on top. This shifted attention away from thickness and toward materials that resisted compression. Now, let's talk about how treated paper and fiberboard became, well, unexpected thermal weapons. The material that filled this gap was impregnated paper, fiberboard, and layered cellulose products. These materials were cheap, light, and easy to mass-produce. But more importantly, they trapped air in rigid structures that didn't collapse under weight. Used in sleeping pads, wall liners, crate shelters, and emergency housing, layered paper insulation reduced conductive heat loss dramatically. Soldiers could sleep warmer on minimal bedding if their contact with the ground was blocked. In civilian shelters during bombings, paperboard liners were installed along walls and floors to stabilize indoor temperatures. These were not permanent solutions, but they worked when nothing else was available. You know, what really mattered wasn't the thickness of the material itself. The key wasn't the paper, not exactly. It was actually the air that got trapped between the layers. By stacking the sheets with just a bit of space between them, engineers managed to create these dead air pockets that really slowed down the flow of heat. This principle, honestly, is still used in advanced insulation today. But back during the Second World War, folks made do with whatever materials they already had on hand. Unlike ordinary blankets, these layered materials, especially when treated, didn't just soak up moisture. Even if they got a bit damp, they still kept most of their insulating power, which was a big step up compared to wool or cotton. So, how did all this actually play out during the war? Well, out in the field, soldiers would layer treated paper right under their bedrolls, or tuck it inside crates that had been turned into makeshift sleeping shelters. In cities that had been bombed, civilians lined their basement walls with any salvaged cardboard, newspapers, or fiberboard they could find, just to keep out the cold from the ground. And refugees, well, they'd stack paper sacks filled with air to make simple but effective insulation barriers. This wasn't just theoretical, you know. It actually reduced frostbite cases, improved sleep, and helped conserve calories. Warmth meant less energy burned simply staying alive. Now, why did this approach conserve fuel and calories? Well, staying warm isn't just about comfort. The cold forces the body to burn more calories. And during wartime, food was rationed, of course. So anything that reduced metabolic demand improved survival odds. By stopping heat loss at contact points, people stayed warmer without burning more fuel or eating more food. This made treated paper insulation a real force multiplier in survival terms. So, here's the thing. Modern homes, well, they've kind of forgotten this lesson. Even today, folks still pile up blankets on top, all the while ignoring those cold floors and chilly walls. Beds end up placed right on cold slabs in uninsulated shelters with thin flooring. Basically, we're recreating the same problems that World War II engineers already solved, you know. Nowadays, insulation in homes is mostly focused on walls and roofs, but honestly, it often neglects those contact surfaces where heat loss is actually the greatest. The World War II approach, it really reminds us that where you put the insulation matters just as much as what material you choose. So, how can you actually use this knowledge in your day-to-day life? Well, you don't need wartime materials to use a bit of wartime logic. Always insulate beneath before piling on layers above. Try using rigid or semi-rigid insulation under sleeping pads, mattresses, or even seating when you're in cold environments. It really does make a difference. In emergency situations, layered cardboard, paperboard, or even compressed paper can, surprisingly, outperform extra blankets when placed under the body. It's important to keep those materials dry, stack the layers to trap air, and always separate yourself from cold surfaces first. For shelters, lining walls and floors with layered material reduces radiant and conductive heat loss even without active heating. What this forgotten insulator teaches us about survival thinking. WW22. Insulation strategies weren't about comfort. They were about efficiency. They understood that preventing heat loss beats producing heat every time. This lesson applies whether you're studying history, preparing for emergencies, or designing resilient living spaces. If this deep dive into forgotten wartime survival technology added value to your understanding, subscribe for more research-driven history and survival content. Share this video with fellow history enthusiasts and preparedness-minded viewers. These lessons still matter.